In the early hours of March 17, 1994, in the Parramore district of Orlando, Florida, 7 men would be found dead, all eliminated in less than 4 hours, all bearing the same mark, a precise shot and the letter J left near their body. The police would take hours to connect the executions, but on the streets of Parramore, everyone already knew. Someone had declared war on the Crimson Vipers, the most feared gang in the neighborhood. And the reason for that war wasn't territory, or drugs, or money. It was a 17-year-old girl named Emily Johnson and her father, a 45-year-old construction contractor, who had never fired a weapon in his life until he had no other choice. If you have the courage to know this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. The story you're about to hear doesn't glorify revenge. It shows you what happens when justice fails and desperation takes its place. Parramore sits in the heart of downtown Orlando, just blocks from the tourist attractions that draw millions to Central Florida each year. In 1994, this neighborhood housed over 45,000 people, many of them living in conditions of extreme poverty. Parramore was only 2 miles from Church Street Station, the entertainment complex where tourists danced and drank expensive cocktails, completely unaware that just beyond the highway overpass existed a world where survival was the only currency that mattered. The houses in Parramore were mostly single-story concrete block structures with peeling paint and chain-link fences sagging from years of neglect. Air conditioning units hung from windows at dangerous angles, dripping condensation onto cracked sidewalks where weeds pushed through every gap in the concrete. In March, the temperature in Orlando reached 82 degrees during the day, but the nights brought a humid warmth that made it impossible to sleep with windows closed. The night air smelled of a mixture of fried chicken from the corner takeout joints, garbage piled in dumpsters behind apartment complexes, and the exhaust fumes from the hundreds of used cars that lined the streets, parked bumper to bumper because most families couldn't afford the luxury of a garage. The constant sound of dogs barking mixed with the bass-heavy rap music pouring from open windows, the laughter of teenagers hanging on street corners, and sometimes, too often, the sharp crack of gunfire that nobody reported to the police because everyone knew that reporting only brought more problems. In those years, Parramore was territory disputed by dozens of gangs that controlled drug dealing, extortion, and robbery. They weren't organized cartels like those operating internationally. They were groups of young men between 16 and 27 years old, some still high school students who had found in the gangs the family they never had at home. They dressed in baggy jeans and oversized sports jerseys, tattooed their nicknames on their arms, and killed each other over control of 3 or 4 blocks. The police knew them, the neighbors feared them, and mothers prayed every night that their sons wouldn't join them. But in neighborhoods where there were no decent schools, no dignified jobs, no visible future, the gangs offered something that nothing else could give: respect, fast money, and the illusion of power. Thomas Johnson had just turned 45 in March of 1994. He was a man of average build, 5 feet 10 inches tall, with broad shoulders shaped by more than 23 years working construction. His hands were rough, with permanent calluses on the palms and small scars on the knuckles from years handling hammers, levels, and power saws. He had a thin scar that crossed his left eyebrow, a reminder of an accident on a job site when a board broke unexpectedly and a piece of wood flew straight into his face. That was in 1987. Since then, when he concentrated while working, his eyebrow furrowed in a strange way, giving him a severe expression that didn't reflect his character. Thomas had been born and raised in Orlando, when Parramore was still a place less dense, less violent. He learned construction from his father, who in turn had learned it from his own. He ran a small contracting business out of an office on West Church, 5 blocks from his house, where he took on renovation jobs, small additions, deck repairs for neighbors in the area. It wasn't a prosperous business, but it allowed him to support his family with dignity. He charged fairly, worked cleanly, and met the deadlines he promised. In a neighborhood where a man's word was worth less and less, Thomas was known as someone you could trust. Every morning at 6:30, Thomas opened his small office. Before beginning work, he sat on a worn wooden stool and drank black coffee that he brought from home in a thermos. He listened to the news on an old Panasonic radio he'd had since the 80s, covered in sawdust with the antenna held up by duct tape. At noon, his wife Karen brought him sandwiches, usually ham and cheese or turkey with lettuce, that he ate sitting in the doorway of his office watching people pass by. In the afternoons, when the heat became unbearable, he took off the denim shirt he always wore and worked in a white undershirt, with an unfiltered cigarette hanging from his lips while he measured lumber for framing. He smoked Pall Malls, the cheapest ones, 4 a day, never more, never less. Thomas had been married to Karen Mitchell for 24 years. They met when they were both 21 at a 4th of July barbecue at a friend's house. He had come with his older brother, she with her girlfriends. They danced all night to Motown Records. 3 months later, Thomas proposed to her with a ring he bought with 2 months' salary. Karen said yes without hesitation. They had 4 children. Michael, 27 years old, who worked as a mechanic at a shop near the Florida Mall. Daniel, 24, who did landscaping work. Robert, 21, who was studying at Valencia Community College. And Emily, the youngest, 17 years old, who was in her junior year at Jones High School and dreamed of studying veterinary medicine at the University of Florida. Emily was the light of Thomas's eyes. From the day she was born, he worked thinking about giving her a better future, a future far from Parramore, far from the violence, far from the gangs that every day became more aggressive. Thomas wasn't a man of conflict. He had lived 45 years without getting into trouble, without owing anything to anyone, without enemies. He knew everyone in the neighborhood, the shopkeepers, the taxi drivers, even some of the gang members who passed by his office. He nodded to them. They responded with respect. Thomas represented something they never had: a present father, an honest job, a stable life. Sometimes the younger ones stopped to watch him work, fascinated by how his hands transformed rough lumber into smooth and useful structure. Thomas never chased them away. He explained what he was doing, let them touch the tools, hoping that maybe one of them would see in his work an alternative to the streets. The Crimson Vipers had dominated Parramore since the early 90s. They weren't the biggest group in Orlando, but they were the most violent in the 4 neighborhoods they controlled. Their name came from the red bandanas they wore and the viper tattoos many members had on their necks or forearms. The Vipers collected protection money from every business in their territory: corner stores, barbershops, auto repair shops, the laundromat on Division Avenue. Those who didn't pay found their windows smashed or worse. The leader of the Crimson Vipers was named Marcus Garrett, but everyone knew him as Vet. He was 24 years old in 1994, but looked older because of the hardness in his face. He was lean but muscular with tattoos covering both arms, names of dead friends, important dates, the image of a red viper on his neck that had given him his street name. Venom had grown up without a father in a housing project in Parramore, where 8 families shared 2 bathrooms. His mother worked cleaning hotel rooms on International Drive, leaving at 5 in the morning and returning at 10 at night. Marcus grew up alone, raised by the streets, and by 14 he was already selling marijuana on corners for a bigger crew. By 18, he had formed the Crimson Vipers with 6 other friends from the neighborhood. By 20, he had been arrested 3 times, once for possession, twice for assault, but never more than 6 months. In Orlando, if you were under 25 and didn't kill anyone important, the system spit you back onto the streets within weeks. Venom wasn't cruel for pleasure. He was cruel for survival and for reputation. In the world of Orlando street gangs, being known as crazy gave you power. If people feared you more than others, you could control more territory, collect more protection money, recruit the best soldiers. Marcus built his reputation with calculated acts of public violence, brutal beatings in broad daylight, threats kept, disproportionate revenge against anyone who challenged him. He had a girlfriend, Tasha, 19 years old, who lived with her grandmother and pretended not to know where the money came from that Marcus used to buy her clothes and jewelry. Tasha was 3 months pregnant in March of 1994. Marcus had promised her he would leave the gang when the baby was born, that he would get a real job, that they would move somewhere else. Tasha believed him because she wanted to believe him, because the alternative was accepting that the father of her child would end up dead on a street before turning 26, like all the others. Thomas Johnson and the Crimson Vipers had coexisted in peace for years. Thomas paid his monthly protection fee of $200, an informal tax that all the business owners in the area had to pay to be left alone. It was unfair, it was extortion, but Thomas saw it as the cost of doing business in Parramore. He paid on time, didn't cause problems, and the Vipers left him alone. Some members of the gang had even hired him for small jobs, fixing a porch, building a fence. Thomas charged them less than normal. They paid in cash without haggling. It was a tense relationship, but functional, based on the mutual respect that exists between a hard-working man and those who control the streets where he worked. But on the afternoon of March 10th, 1994, that peace shattered in the most devastating way possible. It was a Thursday afternoon. Emily Johnson had been walking home from Jones High School, her backpack heavy with textbooks for her chemistry and English class. She took the same route every day, down Division Avenue, past the corner store where Mr. Patterson always waved to her, past the park where children played basketball on a court with bent rims and a cracked asphalt surface. It was 3:40 in the afternoon. The sun was still high and bright. There were people on the streets, mothers with strollers, old men sitting on their porches, cars driving past. Nothing should have happened. But at the corner of Division and 23rd Street, Emily saw something that would change everything. An elderly woman, Mrs. Dolores Washington, 78 years old, had fallen on the sidewalk. Her shopping bags had spilled, cans of soup and boxes of crackers rolling into the street. Mrs. Washington was trying to get up but couldn't, her arthritic knees failing her. People walked past. Nobody stopped. In Parramore, minding your own business was how you stayed alive. But Emily wasn't raised that way. Thomas and Karen had taught their children to help people, to be decent, to be the kind of neighbors they wished everyone could be. Emily dropped her backpack and rushed to Mrs. Washington's side. She helped the elderly woman to her feet, picked up her groceries, walked her to her house 2 blocks away. Mrs. Washington thanked her with tears in her eyes, invited her in for lemonade. Emily politely declined, said she needed to get home. It was 4:15 by the time Emily started walking again. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the streets. She was only 3 blocks from home when a burgundy Chevy Caprice pulled up next to her. 4 members of the Crimson Vipers were inside. Marcus Venom Garrett was driving. Beside him was Derek Snake Williams. In the back were Tyrell T-Bone Jackson and Jerome Razor Hayes. They had been driving around, collecting money from businesses, smoking blunts, looking for trouble because that's what young men with too much power and too little purpose do on Thursday afternoon. Venom saw Emily walking alone. He recognized her, the contractor's daughter, the pretty girl with the long dark hair who always walked with her head down, trying to be invisible. He pulled the car alongside. Snake rolled down the window. "Hey, sweetheart," Snake called out, his gold tooth glinting when he smiled. "Need a ride?" Emily shook her head, kept walking, eyes forward. Her heart was pounding. Every girl in Parramore knew to avoid the Viper. "I'm okay, thank you," she said, voice steady even though her hands were shaking. "Didn't look like a question," Venom said, putting the car in park. All 4 doors opened. Emily ran. She made it maybe 15 feet before T-Bone caught her arm. She screamed. Nobody came. In Parramore, getting involved with the Crimson Vipers was signing your own death warrant. They forced her into the car. Venom drove 2 blocks to an abandoned warehouse behind the old Citrus Bowl, a concrete structure with broken windows and graffiti covering every surface, where addicts went to get high and where bodies sometimes turned up. What happened in that warehouse during the next hour and 40 minutes is something Emily Johnson could never fully articulate in words, something that broke her from the inside in ways no doctor could heal. When they were done with her, they left her lying among broken bottles and used needles with her clothes torn and her soul shattered, and they drove away laughing like it was just another Thursday, like destroying a 17-year-old girl was nothing more than a way to pass the time. At 6:30 in the evening, Michael Johnson, Emily's oldest brother, went looking for her because she hadn't come home from school. He drove his pickup truck through the neighborhood calling her name. He asked at Mr. Patterson's store, at the bus stop where she sometimes waited. Nobody had seen her. At 7 o'clock, he heard a weak crying coming from behind the abandoned warehouse. He ran toward the sound, and what he saw paralyzed his heart. His little sister, the girl who 3 years ago still played with dolls, was sitting against a concrete wall covered in graffiti, hugging herself, rocking back and forth, her eyes staring at nothing. Michael carried her to his truck. Emily didn't speak, didn't cry, just trembled. When Thomas saw her come through the door like that, he knew exactly what had happened. In Parramore, everyone knew what it meant when a girl came home looking like that. Karen screamed, grabbed her daughter, carried her to the bathroom to clean her up. Thomas stood in the living room with his fists clenched, feeling something inside him break irreparably. His other sons, Daniel and Robert, were in shock. Nobody knew what to say, what to do. Karen wanted to go to the police. Thomas knew it was useless. In 1994, reporting a gang in Parramore meant putting a target on your family's back. The police would take the state. The gang members would find out before you left the station, and within a week your whole family would be threatened or dead. Besides, Thomas had lived long enough in this neighborhood to know that justice didn't come to places like Parramore. Justice was for rich people, for those who lived in Winter Park or in the gated communities near Lake Nona. For poor people, there was only impunity, fear, and silence. That night, Thomas Johnson didn't sleep. He sat in his small office surrounded by the smell of fresh-cut wood and paint thinner, with a bottle of cheap whiskey that he didn't open because he needed to think clearly. He thought about his daughter, about her laugh that he might never hear again. He thought about the animals who had done this to her, walking free on the same streets where she would have to keep living. He thought about the face of Marcus Venom Garrett, whom he had greeted hundreds of times without knowing he was capable of something like this. And he thought about something his father had told him many years ago, when Thomas was a boy and some men had tried to rob their house. "Son, when the law doesn't protect you, you have to protect yourself. But doing so has a price that will follow you the rest of your life." Thomas made a decision that night, a decision he knew had no turning back, a decision that would transform him into something he had never been. A man capable of taking another person's life, Not for pleasure, not for hate, but because his daughter deserved justice. And if the state wouldn't give it to her, he would deliver it with his own hand. What Thomas Johnson didn't know was that his decision would unleash a chain of events that would leave 7 men dead, his family destroyed, and Parramore marked forever with a question nobody could answer. Where does justice end, and where does vengeance begin? The days that followed March 10th, 1994, felt like years in the Johnson household. Emily didn't speak for the first 72 hours. She stayed sitting on her bed, staring at the wall, hugging her knees to her chest. Karen tried to feed her chicken noodle soup, grilled cheese sandwiches, sweet tea, but Emily barely touched the food. Her body was in that room, but her soul had been left buried in that warehouse among the broken glass and the filth. The eyes that used to light up when she talked about becoming a veterinarian were now dull, lifeless, like windows of an abandoned house. Thomas watched his daughter from her doorway, unable to enter, unable to know what to say. What words exist for something like this? How can a father repair what has been so brutally destroyed? There were no words, only a heavy silence that filled every corner of the house like toxic smoke. Karen cried in the kitchen when she thought nobody could hear her. Michael punched the walls of his room until his knuckles bled. Daniel smoked cigarette after cigarette in the backyard, staring at nothing. Robert, the youngest son, didn't fully understand what had happened, but he felt the weight of this tragedy crushing his family like a concrete slab. During those days, life in Parramore continued its normal rhythm, indifferent to the suffering of the John. Street vendors shouted their deals on corners. Children played basketball in the dusty parks. Women hung laundry on clotheslines stretched between houses. But for Thomas, the world had stopped. Every time he went outside and saw a member of the Crimson Vipers walking with that arrogance that comes from impunity, he felt his blood boil. They were still there, free, laughing like nothing had happened, like destroying a 17-year-old girl was just another day in their lives as criminals. On Tuesday, March the 13th, Karen convinced Thomas to take Emily to the hospital. They went to Orlando Regional Medical Center, where they waited 5 hours in an emergency room that smelled of cheap disinfectant and sweat. When a young doctor with tired eyes finally saw them, she performed the examination in professional silence. Afterwards, she called Thomas aside. "She has internal injuries," the doctor said, keeping her voice neutral but with contained anger in her eyes. "She needs psychological follow-up, and you need to file a formal report." Thomas clenched his fist. "For what? So the police can take notes and do nothing? So the ones who did this find out we reported them and come finish the job?" The doctor looked down. She had no answer. They both knew how Parramore worked. They both knew that official justice was an illusion for people like that. Thomas took his daughter back home. During the ride on the city bus, Emily clung to his arm tightly, like when she was a little girl and was afraid of getting lost in crowds. Thomas felt something inside him harden, transform into something cold and fine. That night, after everyone went to sleep, he went to his office. He sat at his workbench, surrounded by tools he had used for 23 years to create things, to build structures that made people's homes more comfortable, and he thought about using those same hands for something completely opposite, to destroy, to end life. The next day, Wednesday, March 14th, Thomas did something he had never done. He closed his office on a workday. He hung a sign that said, "Closed for family emergency," and drove his 1988 Ford F-150 to Apopka, the town just north of Orlando. He went to find his brother Raymond. Raymond Johnson was 41 years old and lived in a modest house near the Orange Grove. He had served in the United States Army for 12 years, from 1976 to 1988, and had seen real combat in Grenada and Panama. He was a man of few words, with scars that told stories he never shared. When Thomas knocked on his door that Wednesday morning, Raymond knew immediately that something terrible had happened. Brothers didn't visit without calling ahead. They sat in Raymond's small kitchen. Thomas told him everything, every detail. When he finished, there was a long silence. Raymond lit a cigarette, smoked half of it without saying a word, and finally spoke. "What do you need?" Thomas looked up. "Weapons, knowledge, and you." Raymond nodded slowly. "I'll call Vincent." Vincent Johnson, the youngest brother of Thomas and Raymond, was 39 years old and had also been in the military. The three brothers shared something that their civilian lives had tried to bury. They knew what war was, and now that war had come to their family's door. Over the next few days, the three Johnson brothers, along with Thomas's older sons, Michael, Daniel, and Robert, met secretly in the construction. It looked like a normal family gathering, men drinking beer and talking, but what they discussed wasn't football or work. It was something much darker. Raymond obtained 4 handguns, 2 9mm Berettas, and 2 .38 revolvers through a contact from his Army days, a former sergeant who now sold illegal weapons at gun shows in Ocala. They cost $11,000 total, the savings Thomas had put away for Emily's college education. The irony was bitter, using the money for her future to avenge. The weapons arrived on Friday, March 16th, wrapped in oily rags inside a toolbox. Thomas held them for the first time in his life. The weight of the cold metal in his hands made him nauseous. He wasn't a man of violence. He was a contractor, a father. But the Vipers had turned him into something different. Vincent, who had been a marksmanship instructor in the army, taught Thomas, Michael, Daniel, and Robert the basics during the nights in an abandoned lot on the outskirts of Parramore. They practiced with beer bottles, shooting into dirt berms to minimize noise. Thomas learned to hold the weapon, to aim, to pull the trigger without anticipating the recoil. He wasn't an expert marksman, but he didn't need to be. The distances would be short. Meanwhile, during the days, the 6 men did something even more important than practicing shooting. Reconnaissance. Raymond taught them to observe without being observed, to memorize patterns, to identify vulnerability. For 1 full week, they discreetly followed the members of the Crimson Vipers throughout Parramore. They discovered that Derek "Snake" Williams stood guard every night at the corner of Division and 22nd Street. From 2 in the morning until 6. He smoked heavily, got distracted with his pager, and often fell asleep leaning against a wall. They discovered that Tyrell T-Bone Jackson and Jerome Razor Hayes sold drugs out of an abandoned house on Lake Street, and that in those early morning hours they were usually alone without backup. They discovered that Marcus Venom Garrett met every night with his 2 lieutenants, Curtis Blade Thompson and Lamar Spider Davis, in the parking lot behind the Chevron gas station on Orange Blossom Trail, to count the day's money from extortion and drug sale. They arrived around 4:15 in the morning, stayed for about 30 minutes, and then everyone went their separate ways. Michael made a detailed map in a notebook, names, addresses, route. He studied it until he had it memorized. Daniel got an old taxi that a friend lent him without asking questions, to have mobility without using traceable vehicles. Robert, the youngest, was assigned as driver and lookout. His job was to alert them if police appeared. On Sunday, March 16th, 1 week after the assault, there was a moment of normalcy that now seems unreal. Karen insisted that the whole family eat together, like they did every Sunday. She made pot roast with mashed potatoes, Thomas's favorite meal. She set the table with the flowered tablecloth her mother had given her when she got married. She lit the candles on the small altar to Jesus she kept in the living room. Emily came downstairs from her room for the first time in days. She sat at the table without saying anything, but at least she was present. Everyone ate in heavy silence, interrupted only by the sound of forks against plate. The pot roast tasted like ashes in Thomas's mouth, but he ate so as not to worry Karen more. After eating, while Karen washed dishes, Thomas went out to the small backyard. The sky was overcast, threatening rain. Robert came out to join. "Dad," Robert said with a trembling voice, "are we really going to do this?" Thomas didn't respond immediately. He lit a Pall Mall, inhaled deeply, let the smoke fill his lungs. "Your sister will never be the same, son. What those animals did to her has no forgiveness, not from God or from men. But after this, we won't be the same either." Thomas looked at his youngest son. He was 21 years old. He should be thinking about girls, about parties, about his future, not about killing people. "You're right, but if we don't do this, how are we going to live? How is your sister going to live, knowing the men who destroyed her are walking free?" "No, son. Some sins can only be paid with blood." Robert nodded. He said nothing more. They both stood there under the gray sky, smoking in silence. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He stayed in the living room, sitting on the couch where he had watched his children grow up, where he had comforted Emily when she fell off her bicycle at 8 years old, where he had celebrated birthdays and Christmas. He thought about everything he was going to lose, not just his freedom, he had already accepted that, but something deeper. His soul, his innocence, the image his children had of him as a good man. He could stop, he could take his family, pack what little they had and run. Georgia, Alabama, anywhere. Start over with false names, new jobs. But he knew that was an illusion. The Vipers had connections, and more importantly, Emily would never heal knowing her attackers were still alive, free, maybe doing the same thing to another girl. No, the only way to give his daughter peace was to eliminate the source of her pain. Thomas walked to Emily's room. He opened the door carefully. She was sleeping, or pretending to sleep, curled in a fetal position. The light from the street lamp came through the window without curtains, drawing shadows on her face. Thomas knelt next to her bed, like he did when she was a little girl and had nightmares. "Forgive me, sweetheart," he whispered so low he wasn't even sure he had spoken out loud. "Forgive me for not protecting you. Forgive me for what I'm about to do, but I can't let them keep breathing the same air as—" Emily didn't move, but Thomas thought he saw a tear roll down her cheek. He left the room. Karen was waiting for him in the hallway with her arms crossed. She didn't need to ask. She knew. A wife always knows. When? She asked Tomorrow, early morning Wednesday. Karen closed her eyes. 2 tears ran down her cheeks, but she didn't try to stop him. She knew there was nothing to say. She knew her husband was no longer the quiet contractor she had married 24 years ago. Life in Parramore had transformed them all into something harder, more desperate. Come back. That's all, Teresa said. Do what you have to do, but come back. Thomas hugged her. She smelled of lavender soap and cornbread. She smelled of home, a home he was about to destroy. On Tuesday, March the 16th, the 6 men of the Johnson family met one last time in the construction office. They checked the weapons, verified the ammunition, went over the plan one more time. Raymond, with his military experience, had designed a precise operation. 7 targets in 4 different locations, executed in a period of 3.5 hours between 2:30 and 6 in the morning. Fast, clean, before the sun came. Once it starts, Raymond said with a firm voice, there's no turning back. If anyone wants out, this is the time. Nobody moved. The 6 men looked at each other. Father, brothers, uncles, sons, family, united by something stronger than blood, by a violated love and a thirst for justice that the system had denied. Michael spoke. For Emily. The others repeated, for Emily. In that moment, as Thomas Johnson cleaned his .38 revolver in the office, filled with the smell of wood and gun oil, just 3 miles away, Marcus Venom Garrett was drinking Corona beers with his friends on a corner of Parramore, laughing at some dirty joke, planning the next robbery, completely unaware that 6 men had decided his days were numbered. Unaware that in less than 14 hours, Parramore would wake up to 7 bodies and a question nobody could answer. When does a father stop being a victim and become an executioner? They separated around midnight. Everyone went home to rest a few hours. Thomas arrived at 12:30. The house was silent. Karen was pretending to sleep. Emily was in her room. Thomas sat on the living room couch with the pistol hidden under his shirt. He didn't sleep, just waited. Waited for the clock to reach 2 in the morning. Waited for something to begin that couldn't be stopped. At 1:50 in the morning on March 17, 1994, Thomas Johnson got up from the couch. He stood before the small picture of Jesus hanging on the wall, made the sign of the cross. He didn't pray. He no longer had the right. He simply said, "Watch over my family when I'm gone." He left his house at exactly 2 o'clock. The night was dark, moonless. The streets of Parramore slept. Stray dogs barked in the distance. Thomas got into the old taxi that Daniel had obtained. Robert was at the wheel, Michael in the back seat. Raymond and Vincent were waiting at another location. Thomas checked his weapon one last time. 6 bullets in the cylinder, enough for 2 men. The others would carry the other weapon. They had a plan, they had a list, and they had something more dangerous than any weapon. They had the certainty of men who no longer had anything to lose. At 2:15 in the morning on March 17th, 6 members of the Johnson family headed to different points in Parramore with a single purpose. What happened in the next 4 hours wouldn't just change their lives. It would change the way all of Orlando understood concepts like justice, vengeance, and how far a father can go to protect his daughter. The Crimson Vipers slept peacefully, confident in their impunity, not knowing that the quiet contractor from the office on West Church Street had stopped being that. And that when the sun rose over Orlando, 7 of them would never see another dawn. 2:30 in the morning on March 17th, 1994. Temperature 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky over Parramore was completely black. No stars visible through the light pollution from the city. The empty streets smelled of accumulated garbage and hot asphalt that was barely beginning to cool. The only sound was the distant hum of electrical transformers and the occasional barking of stray dogs chasing rats through the alleys. Thomas Johnson sat in the back seat of the old taxi Daniel had obtained, parked half a block from the corner of Division Avenue and 22nd. Robert was driving. Michael was in the passenger. All 3 in absolute silence. Thomas held the .38 revolver in his hands. The metal was cold. It weighed more than he had imagined, not physically but in another way, as if the weight of what he was about to do condensed into that small object. His hands weren't shaking. That surprised. He had expected fear, nausea, the impulse to turn back, but he only felt a strange calm, almost unnatural, as if he had stopped being Thomas Johnson the contractor and had become something colder, simpler, a tool with a single purpose. "You ready?" Michael whispered without turning. Thomas didn't respond. He opened the taxi door. The night air hit his face. He stepped onto the empty street. For the last time he thought about his daughter, about her laugh before March 10th, about her dead eyes after. He thought about the picture of Jesus he had crossed himself before on his wall. He thought about the hell that probably awaited him. "Forgive me, God," he murmured, "but this is the only thing I can do." He walked toward the corner where Derek "Snake" Williams stood guard. Derek "Snake" Williams was 19 years old. He was leaning against a brick wall with peeling paint, smoking a Newport cigarette he had taken from a college kid that afternoon. He had a Walkman clipped to his belt, listening to Snoop Dogg through foam headphones. His pistol, a cheap .22, was tucked in the waistband of his pants. He was half asleep, eyes half closed, thinking about his girlfriend Keisha, about the baby she had told him she was expecting 2 weeks ago. He didn't hear the footsteps approach. Thomas came from his blind spot. He stood in front of him. Snake opened his eyes, pulled out one headphone. He saw Thomas. He recognized him. The contractor from the neighborhood, the quiet old man from the office. He smiled, confused. "Mr. Johnson, what you doing out this late?" The gunshot sounded dry in the silent night. Snake slid down the wall, eyes open, expression of surprise frozen. The cigarette rolled from his lips. It stayed lit, glowing faintly on the ground. Thomas stood there for 3 seconds that felt like hours. He had just taken someone's life. He had just crossed the line that separates civilized men from animals. He waited to feel something. Horror, remorse, nausea. But he only felt a cold emptiness. He took out a small can of red spray paint from his pocket. On the wall, next to the body, he painted a large letter. J, for Johnson, for what they had done to his family. He turned and walked back to the taxi. Robert started the engine without a word. They disappeared into the darkness of Parramore. First blood. 6 to go. 2:55 in the morning. 6 blocks away, Raymond and Vincent Johnson were entering silently into the abandoned house on Lake Street where Tyrell T-Bone Jackson and Jerome Razor Hayes sold drugs. The door had no lock, just a piece of plywood across it that they removed without making noise. Inside it smelled of mildew, marijuana, and urine. There was a candle burning on a cardboard box that served as a table. The 2 gang members were sitting on the floor counting crumpled bills and separating small bags of white powder. Tyrell T-Bone, Tentar Novamente. A Continuar Jackson looked up when Raymond entered. He was 22 years old and looked 30 because of the thinness caused by his own addiction. He saw the gun, raised his hands. "Easy, man. If you're here for the spot, we can work something out." "Venom won't." "We're not here for your spot," Raymond said with a flat military voice. "We're here for you." Jerome Razor Hayes, 20 years old, tried to reach for his pistol lying on the box. Vincent was faster. 2 quick shots. Razor fell backward. T-Bone screamed. He tried to run toward the back door. He didn't make it. Gunpowder smoke filling the room. The candle kept burning, casting dancing shadows on the dirty wall. Raymond painted the letter J with spray paint on the wall. The 2 brothers walked out of the abandoned house. Outside, a stray cat watched them with glowing yellow eyes. Then it continued on its way, indifferent. 3 dead. 4 to go. 3:20 in the morning. Thomas sat in the taxi parked 1 block from the quick-stop convenience store on Orange Avenue. Robert and Michael watched him, waiting. They knew this one was different. Curtis Blade Thompson worked night shift at this store. He had been one of the 4 in that warehouse. "You want me to go?" Michael offered, seeing the tension in his father's shoulder. "No," Thomas responded. "This one's mine." He got out of the taxi. He walked the 100 yards, separating him from the store. The lights were on inside, fluorescent tubes buzzing and flickering. Thomas could see through the barred window. Curtis was behind the counter reading a magazine about cars, eating a bag of Doritos, completely unaware. Thomas knocked on the glass door. Curtis looked up, saw him, recognized the contractor, smiled, walked toward the door to open it, probably thinking Mr. Johnson needed to buy something for his office. He opened the door, the smile still on his face. "Mr. Johnson, what can I get you this late?" Then he saw the pistol. The smile died. Thomas entered the store, closed the door behind him, looked directly into the eyes of the 21-year-old man who had been among those who destroyed his daughter. "Do you remember the girl you brought to that warehouse 11 days ago?" Thomas's voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was something in it more terrifying than any scream. Curtis backed up. His legs hit the counter. There was no way out. I didn't. It was Venom who." "You were there. You hurt her." "Mr. Johnson, please, I'm 21. I can change. My daughter was 17. The shot echoed between the narrow walls of the store. Bags of chips fell from the shelf from the vibration. The car magazine slid from the counter to the floor, pages open showing a red Mustang. Thomas painted the letter J on the glass door. He walked out. The fluorescent light kept buzzing, flickering, as if nothing had happened. While Thomas eliminated his 3rd target, just 2 miles away at Mama's Kitchen, a 24-hour diner on Church Street, Miss Dorothy Williams, 64 years old, turned on the grill like she did every morning for the past 32 years. She started preparing scrambled eggs and bacon, filling her small restaurant with the smell of coffee and butter. Her radio played Aretha Franklin. She hummed along with the song, happy, thinking about her grandson who would turn 5 tomorrow. She didn't know that a few blocks away 7 families were losing everything. She didn't know that Parramore would never be the same. 4:15 in the morning. In the parking lot behind the Chevron gas station on Orange Blossom Trail, Marcus Venom Garrett, Lamar Spider Davis, and another Viper named Antonio Ace Martinez sat on the hood of a burgundy Chevy Caprice counting the day's money from extortion. They had collected $7,000. Good day. Venom separated bills for each person. Spider smoked a blunt. Ace drank a warm Budweiser. They talked about basketball. The Magic had won. They bet on the next game. They laughed. They were 3 young men, 24, 23, and 22 years old, who had chosen the wrong path but were still capable of laughing, of dreaming, of thinking they had a few. They didn't see the 2 vehicles that parked blocking both exits of the parking. They didn't see the 6 men get out simultaneously, armed, moving with military precision. Venom saw them first. He dropped the money. His hand went for his pistol. He wasn't fast enough. "Vipers!" Ace shouted, diving behind the car. The gunshots exploded in the enclosed space of the parking lot, bullets ricocheting off concrete walls, breaking windows of abandoned cars. Spider ran toward the east exit. Daniel intercepted him. 2 shots. Spider collapsed against a rusted dump. Ace pulled his weapon, fired wildly without aiming. A bullet passed by Vincent's head. Vincent responded with 3 precise shots. Military training taking control. Ace fell. Venom was cornered against a wall, pistol in hand, looking at the 6 men surrounding him. He recognized Thomas at the front. "Johnson?" He spat the name with hate and surprise. "Didn't know you had the ball." "Neither did I," Thomas responded. Venom laughed, a bitter laugh without humor. "You think this ends with me? I got cousins, brothers, friends. They gonna come for your fam." "You don't have anybody anymore," Raymond interrupted. "Your Vipers are dead. 5 so far. 1 more after you." Venom processed this. For the first time in his life, real fear crossed his face. Not fear of dying, he had accepted that since he entered this life, but fear of having been defeated by an old contractor and his family. "Son of a bitch," he whispered with something like respect. "All this over some girl." Thomas took a step forward, the pistol steady in his hand. "For my daughter. Her name is Emily Johnson. I want you to remember it when you get to hell." "There," Venom responded. The 6 shots sounded almost simultaneous. Venom slid down the wall, leaving a trail Thomas would never paint with spray paint because it wasn't necessary. The leader of the Crimson Vipers was dead, and with him the gang ceased to exist. In the silence that followed, only the dripping of water from a broken pipe in the wall could be heard. The 6 men of the Johnson family stood there in the middle of the parking lot, surrounded by evidence of what they had done. Michael was shaking. Daniel had tears running down his cheeks. Robert vomited in a corner. Vincent and Raymond remained motionless with military discipline, but their eyes showed the weight of crossing that line again. Thomas looked at his hands, these hands that had framed houses, that had carried his children as babies, that had built decks for families to enjoy together. Now they were a killer's hand. 2 names remained on the list. 2 men who at that moment slept deeply, unaware that they were already dead and just waiting for fate to catch up with them. 4:45 in the morning. Lamont Smoke Jefferson, 25 years old, lived on the 3rd floor of the Pine Hills apartments in a 2-bedroom unit he shared with his sick mother, who had diabetes, and his 15-year-old sis. Smoke was Venom's right hand, the enforcer of the most brutal decisions. He had a tattoo on his chest that said, "Only God can judge me." He was about to discover that wasn't true. Thomas and Michael climbed the stairs in silence. The building smelled of stale food and mildew. Someone had left a broken tricycle on the 2nd floor landing. A candle to the Virgin Mary flickered in a window. Normal life. Families sleeping. Children dreaming of better tomorrows. They reached apartment 307. Thomas knocked on the door. 3 soft knocks. They waited. Footsteps inside. A woman's voice. Elder. "Who is it?" "Police." Thomas lied. "We need to talk to Lamont." More footsteps. Chain being removed. The door opened. Smoke was there in sweatpants and a tank top, sleep in his face, pistol in his hand out of precaution. He saw Thomas, recognized him. His eyes widened. He didn't have time to shout. The shot threw him backward into the apartment. His mother screamed from her room. Michael entered quickly, closed the door, painted the J on the hallway wall while Thomas shouted to the mother to stay in her room, not to come out, that this wasn't about her. They ran down the stair. Above, dogs barked. Lights came on in windows. Someone was yelling. Time was running out. 5:20 in the morning. 1 remained. Carlos Cisco Ruiz, 23 years old, who hadn't been present on March 10th but was part of the Vipers, who recruited middle school kids to sell drugs, who beat shopkeepers who didn't pay protection money. Vincent and Raymond found him leaving his girlfriend's house, an 18-year-old girl who didn't know her boyfriend was a gang member. Cisco walked down the empty street whistling a song by Tupac, hands in his pockets, thinking about sleeping a few hours before the sun came up. Vincent stepped out of the shadows. Cisco saw him. He ran. Raymond intercepted him from the other side. He was trapped between the two ex-military men. There was no escape. "Why?" Cisco shouted. "I wasn't even there with the girl. I didn't do nothing." "You're part of the Vipers," Vincent said simply. "That's enough." The last shot of the night echoed through Parramore at 5:27 in the morning on March 17, 1994. The seventh and final body fell on a nameless street with the letter J painted on the nearest wall. 5:45 in the morning. The sky began to lighten transforming from black to dark blue to gray. The first light of day touched the rusted tin roofs of Parramore. Somewhere a rooster crowed. A garbage truck began its route. Mama's kitchen opened its doors, filling the street with the smell of fresh-baked biscuits. Normal life. A day like any other. Except that in 4 different locations in the neighborhood, 7 men lay dead, all with the same red mark on nearby wall. The 6 men of the Johnson family met at Thomas's construction office. Nobody spoke for the first 10. They sat on the concrete floor among wood shavings and tools, with the weapons on the workbench, with their hands stained with gunpowder and conscience. Robert cried silent. Michael stared at nothing. Daniel smoked with trembling hands. Vincent and Raymond remained motionless, but their eyes had seen too much. Again, Thomas stood by the window, watching dawn break over Orlando, seeing his reflection in the dirty glass. The man looking back at him was a stranger. "What did we do?" Robert whispered. Nobody answered because everyone knew the answer. They had crossed a line that should never be crossed. They had taken justice into their own hands. They had eliminated 7 lives, some guilty, all human, each one with mothers who would cry, with sisters who would ask why. Thomas thought about Emily, about whether this would give her peace or just add more weight to her trauma. He thought about Karen waiting at home, sleepless, praying. He thought about the contractor he was 24 hours ago, and the killer he had become. "There's no going back," he said finally. "What's done is done. Now we just wait." Outside, Parramore was waking up. Children walked to school. Women swept their sidewalks. Street vendors set up their carts. And somewhere, someone was about to find the first body, and then everything would change. But the bloodbath of Parramore was just beginning to be discovered. And when the sun finished rising over Orlando, the questions nobody could answer would fill every conversation, every fear, every nightmare. Who? Why? How many more would fall before this ended? 6 hours after the last shot, Parramore was fully awakening to its new reality. The sun was already high in the Florida sky, temperature climbing toward 85 degrees, the humid heat of midday beginning to settle in. Life continued with its normal rhythm. City buses packed with workers heading downtown, street vendors shouting offers of fresh fruit, children playing in dusty lots. But that normalcy was about to explode. 6:45 in the morning, Mr. Arthur Patterson, 60 years old, owner of the corner store on Division Avenue, who had known every family in Parramore for 35 years, was opening his metal security gate when he saw something that made him stop. A body slumped against the wall across the street. A thin young man with headphones still in his ears. At first he thought the kid was sleeping. Gang members sometimes fell asleep during their guard shifts, but there was something about the position, about the absolute stillness, that wasn't sleep. Mr. Patterson approached slowly. He saw the dark stain on the wall behind the body. He saw the red letter painted with spray paint. J. His legs stopped working. His keys fell from his hands with a metallic clatter. Mr. Patterson fell to his knee, breathing accelerating, hands shaking. He had lived in Orlando his whole life, had seen violence, but something about this, the precision, the marked letter, the absolute silence around it, told him this was different. He pulled out his cell phone with trembling hands. He dialed 911. The operator answered with a bored voice, accustomed to reports of violence in Parramore. "There's a dead body," Mr. Patterson said, "on Division Avenue. There's a letter on the wall, a red J." "Just one?" the operator asked. "I don't know. I only see one. But something tells me there's more." While Mr. Patterson waited for police sitting on the curb, just 3 blocks away, a mother left her house to take her children to school. 2 blocks further, a baker opened his shop, putting fresh donuts in the display case. 4 blocks north, construction workers waited for the bus that would take them to job sites downtown. Normal life, daily routine. Nobody knew yet that Parramore had been marked by something that would change its history forever. The first patrol car from the Orlando Police Department arrived at 7:10. 2 young officers, neither older than 26, got out of the white Crown Victoria with blue stripes. They checked the body, called on the radio. Within 20 minutes, a second patrol arrived, then a third. By 8 o'clock, when reports started coming in from other locations, an abandoned house on Lake Street, the quick stop on Orange Avenue, the parking lot behind the Chevron station, the Orlando Police Department sent their best man. Detective Marcus Reed was 49 years old and had 24 years of service with the Orlando Police Department. He was a tall, lean man with graying hair, cut military short, and hands that had cuffed hundreds of criminals. He had worked through the most violent era of Orlando's gang wars. He had seen drug executions, settling of scores between rival crews, domestic violence that ended in tragedy. He thought nothing could surprise him anymore. He was wrong. He arrived at the parking lot scene at 9:15. 3 bodies, shell casings everywhere, blood already dried by the heat. The letter J marked on multiple walls. His subordinate, Officer Martinez, a 29-year-old rookie recently promoted to detective, waited for him with a pale face. "Detective," Martinez said, voice shaking, "we've got 7 confirmed bodies, 7 different locations, all executed between 2 and 6 this morning, all with the same mark." Reed walked slowly around the scenes. He observed everything with the trained eye of 2 decades chasing criminals. The angles of the shots, the positions of the bodies, the shell case, 9mm and .38 caliber, cheap but effective weapon. The letter J painted with red spray paint at each location, always near the body, but never on. "This wasn't a gang fight," he said finally, crouching to pick up a casing with a latex glove. "Gang fights are disorganized, chaotic. This was planned, almost military." "Military?" Martinez asked. "Look at the locations, all strategic, all within a 10-block radius, executed in sequence. Whoever did this knew their targets, knew their routines, knew their vulnerability." Reed stood up, looking around the parking lot. "And look at this. 3 men dead here, but only 2 weapons on the ground. Means at least one didn't get his gun out." They were surprised by someone who knew exactly when and where they'd be. Over the next hours, while the forensics team from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement arrived with their silver cases and cameras, while they cordoned off the 7 scenes with yellow tape that said, "Police line do not cross," while curious neighbors crowded behind the barriers trying, Reed began assembling the puzzle. He identified the 7 victims, all men between 19 and 25 years old, all known members of the Crimson Viper, and, most importantly, Marcus Venom Garrett, the undisputed leader, was among the dead. The Vipers had been eliminated in a single night, completely, surgically. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Reed received a report that changed everything. A filed report dated March 11th, 6 days before the massacre. Orlando Regional Medical Center. A 17-year-old minor, Emily Johnson, had been brought by her father for medical examination after being assaulted. The doctor had documented injuries consistent with sexual assault. The names of the attackers were never revealed. The family refused to file a formal police report out of fear of retaliation, but the father had been registered. Thomas Johnson, 45 years old, construction contractor, address on West Church. Reed felt something heavy settle in his stomach. It wasn't triumph at solving the case. It was something more complicated. Pity, perhaps. Understand. He gathered his team at the station at 4 o'clock. 12 officers sitting around a cheap plastic table, ceiling fans spinning slowly without cooling anything, maps of Parramore spread across the surface. "We're not looking for an ordinary criminal," Reed said, voice tight. "We're looking for a father who did what the system couldn't do." Officer Martinez, young and idealistic still, asked what everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to say. "And when we find him, detective, what do we do?" Reed looked out the dirty window of the station toward the streets of Orlando he had patrolled for 24 years. Streets where justice was a pretty word without real meaning, where hardworking families paid protection money to 19-year-old gang members because the police couldn't or wouldn't protect them, where 17-year-old girls were assaulted and the perpetrators walked free because reporting meant signing a death warrant for your whole family. "When we find him," he said slowly, "I'm going to have to arrest a man who probably did what I would have done in his place, and then I'm going to have to sleep with that the rest of my life." In Parramore, news of the massacre spread like fire on gasoline. By 6 o'clock, the whole neighborhood knew. 7 Vipers dead, Venom executed, a letter J marking each scene. And though nobody said it openly, everyone knew whose J that was. Opinions were divided like the neighborhood itself. At Mr. Patterson's store, where old men played checkers every afternoon, men talked in low voice. Some said Thomas was a hero, that he had freed Parramore from a plague. Somebody had to do it, Mr. Patterson said, 70 years old, moving a checker. The police never do anything. This man did. Others disagreed. "He's a murderer," said James the barber. "Doesn't matter what they did to his daughter. Killing 7 people makes him a criminal, just like them. The women gathered at the laundromat or on their porches talked different. For them, Thomas Johnson was a father who did what he had to do. How many of them secretly wished they had that courage to protect their own children from the gang members who harassed their daughters on corners, from the dealers who recruited their sons at middle school? "If they had touched my daughter like that," said Mrs. Williams, mother of 4, folding laundry at the laundromat, "I would have done the same thing, and may God forgive me, but I wouldn't regret it." The young people didn't know what to think. Some saw Thomas as an example, proof that fathers still protected their families in a world that every day became more dangerous. Others saw him as a warning of how far desperation could go when the law fails. But everyone agreed on one thing: Parramore had changed. The Vipers had controlled these streets for years, collecting protection money, selling drugs, recruiting children, assaulting women. And in one single night, a 45-year-old contractor had erased them from the map. The message was clear. Nobody was untouchable, not even those who thought fear protected. Thomas Johnson didn't run. For 9 days, he continued living in his house on Magnolia Avenue. He continued opening his construction office. Every morning, he continued working like nothing had happened. Karen told him they should leave, that they should take the kids and disappear to Georgia or Alabama. But Thomas knew running was useless. Sooner or later, they would find him. And more importantly, running meant admitting he had done something wrong. And in his heart, pierced through with all the pain and guilt, he didn't believe he had. On March 26th, 9 days after the massacre, Detective Marcus Reed arrived at Thomas Johnson's office with 6 armed officers. They entered with pistols drawn, expecting resistance. There was none. Thomas was at his workbench, sanding a piece of pine, old radio playing country music. He had sawdust in his hair, hands stained with varnish. He looked up when they entered. He didn't seem surprised. "Thomas Johnson," Reed said. Official voice, but without the edge he normally used with criminals. "Yes, you're under arrest for 7 counts of premeditated murder committed in the early morning hours of March 17th. Thomas put down the sandpaper on the table. He wiped his hands on his jeans. He looked Reed directly in the eyes. There was no defiance there, only exhaustion. "Accepted." "I know," he said simply. "I was waiting for you." They put the handcuffs on him. Thomas didn't resist. As they walked him out of the office, he passed by his workbench where there was a photo taped to the wall. Emily, at 8 years old, smiling with 2 pigtails, holding an ice cream cone. Thomas looked at it one last time, then he let them take him. Outside, neighbors had gathered. Some cried. Others applauded discreetly. Most just watched in silence, not knowing what to feel about a man who had crossed the line between victim and perpetrator in one night of violence. Karen stood in the doorway of their house holding Emily. Both were crying. Thomas looked at them as they put him in the patrol car. He wanted to say something, that he was sorry, that he loved them, that it was worth it, but there were no words for that. Only the sound of the patrol car door closing, the engine starting, the streets of Parramore fading through the rear window. That night, while Thomas Johnson spent his first night in a cell at the Orange County Jail, accused of 7 murders he knew he had committed and for which he would never feel remorse, Detective Marcus Reed sat in his empty office with a bottle of cheap whiskey. He didn't open it, just looked at it, turning it in his hand. He had arrested hundreds of criminals in 24 years. Drug dealers, killers, rapists. And he had always slept well knowing he had taken monsters off the streets. But this time was different. This time he had arrested a father who did what the system had failed to do. A man who asked for help and didn't receive it. A man who took justice into his own hands because official justice was an empty word in neighborhoods like Parramore. The question that obsessed him, the question that obsessed all of Orlando, was simple and terrible at the same time. Had Thomas Johnson done the right thing? Was he a hero or a murderer? Victim or criminal? Where did defense of family end, and where did premeditated murder begin? Reed put the bottle away unopened. He turned off the light in his office. He drove home in silence. That night he didn't sleep, and he knew many more nights would come where the face of Thomas Johnson, calm, resigned, without regret, would haunt him in the darkness, asking him again and again, "What would you have done?" 18 months after the Parramore massacre, in September of 1995, the trial of Thomas Johnson and his 5 accomplices began in an Orange County courtroom. The room was packed. Journalists, curious onlookers, families of the victims, neighbors from Parramore who had traveled an hour on city buses to witness the verdict. Outside the building, small groups protested, some with signs that said, "Justice for Emily," others with photos of the 7 dead men and the words, "They were somebody's sons too." The charges were clear. 7 counts of premeditated first-degree murder with aggravating circumstance. The evidence was overwhelming. Shell casings that matched the weapons found in Thomas's office. Testimony from neighbors. The letter J marked at each scene. The defense, led by a public defender named Richard Crawford, who had just turned 32, tried to argue justifiable defense of family honor, invoking a nearly forgotten legal concept dating back to old Florida statute. The prosecutor destroyed that argument in 20 minutes. 7 men executed at different locations over a period of 4 hours, with clear evidence of military-style planning, wasn't justifiable defense. It was premeditated revenge. It was aggravated multiple murder. The jury, 12 people from Orange County who knew perfectly well how gangs operated in Parramore, who probably paid protection money to similar groups, who maybe had daughters Emily's age, deliberated for 13 hours. Some reports say there were tears in the deliberation, that the debate was fierce, that 4 jurors wanted acquittal and had to be convinced. The verdict came at 9:30 in the evening on September 22, 1990. Guilty on all 7 counts. Thomas Johnson, sentenced to 30 years in prison. Raymond Johnson, 25 years. Vincent Johnson, 25 years. Michael Johnson, 18 years. Daniel Johnson, 18. Robert Johnson, 18. When the judge read the sentences, Thomas remained motionless. There were no tears, no surprise, no protest, just a slight nod, almost imperceptible, as if he had known since that morning of March 17th that it would end exactly like this. When the guards approached to handcuff him, he looked toward the gallery where Karen and Emily sat. Karen cried silently. Emily, now 19 years old, stared at the floor, unable to meet her father's eye. The only thing Thomas asked the judge was to be allowed to hug his daughter one last time before they took him to the Florida State Prison. The judge denied the request. The defendant represents a danger to others, he said, though everyone in that courtroom knew that Thomas Johnson had never been dangerous to anyone except the men who had destroyed his family. Thomas Johnson served 28 years and 4 months in the Florida State Prison. During that time, he worked in the prison carpentry shop, teaching other inmates to build tables, chairs, cabinets. He was quiet, respected even by more violent criminals. He never looked for trouble. Guards said he was the calmest prisoner they had ever known. He read extensively, novels by Hemingway, biographies of historical figures, philosophy books that his brother Raymond sent him from his own cell in another wing. Karen visited him once a month for 20 years without fail, until her health began to deteriorate. She died of breast cancer in 2013 at 60 years old. Thomas couldn't attend the funeral. They denied him permission. A guard told him afterward that Emily had been there with her husband and her 3 children, grandchildren Thomas had never met, who didn't even know their grandfather was alive. Emily never visited her father in prison, not once in 28 years. After the trial, she moved to Atlanta with a maternal aunt. She changed her last name from Johnson to her mother's maiden name, Mitchell. She cut all contact with her past. She studied veterinary medicine at the University of Georgia. She graduated in 2000 with honors. She married in 2005 to an accountant named David, who never knew the complete truth about his father-in-law. They had 3 children, Sarah, born in 2007, Michael, born in 2009, and Jacob, born in 2012. Today in 2025, Emily is 48 years old and works at a veterinary clinic in the suburbs of Atlanta. She treats dogs, cats, birds. She saves small lives every day. Her husband says she has occasional nightmares, that sometimes she wakes up screaming, but that she never talks about them. Her children know her as a loving but distant mother, affectionate but incapable of a certain emotional intimacy, as if a part of her is permanently frozen in some moment of her past that she never shared. Every March 17th, no matter what day of the week it is, Emily lights a white candle in her house. Not for the 7 victims, not for her father, for the 17-year-old girl who died that afternoon of March 10th, 1994, along with the Crimson Viper, the innocent girl who never again slept without fear, who never again fully trusted the world, who lost something no revenge could recover. Thomas Johnson was released on July 15, 2023, at 74 years old, after serving 28 years and 4 months with good behavior. He walked out of the Florida State Prison on a Friday morning with a plastic bag containing his belongings, 2 books, an old photo of his family, and a rosary Karen had given him on her last visit before she died. The world he found outside was unrecognizable. America had changed. Orlando had changed. He had changed. Emily came to meet him at the prison gate. Thomas saw her approaching, a 46-year-old woman who still had the eyes of the girl he had known, but with premature wrinkles around them, with the weight of 28 years of silence. They looked at each other for a long minute without speaking. Then Emily hugged him. She didn't say, "I forgive you." She didn't say, "You did the right thing." She only whispered, "Are you okay, Dad?" Thomas nodded, unable to speak. They cried together in the parking lot of the Florida State Prison, while guards and released prisoners walked around them, indifferent to that moment of broken, imperfect, painful reconciliation. Thomas's brothers had varied fates. Raymond and Vincent were released in 2015 after serving 20 years. Both moved to different states. Raymond to North Carolina, Vincent to Tennessee, where they work in construction under false names. Neither talks about that now. Michael, Daniel, and Robert were released between 2008 and 2011. Michael opened an auto repair shop in Jacksonville. Daniel found work at a furniture factory in Tampa. Robert, the youngest, the one who vomited in the parking lot after seeing the bodies, became a Baptist minister at a small church in Gainesville. He preaches every Sunday about forgiveness, redemption, and the weight of living with sins that never completely erase. After his release, Thomas moved to a small efficiency apartment in Kissimmee, 30 miles from Orlando. He works part-time at a Habitat for Humanity, building homes for families who can't afford them. He doesn't talk about his past. His co-workers know him as a quiet old man who's good with his hands. Emily visits him once every few months. They have coffee. They talk about her children, about her work. They never talk about March 1994. Some wounds don't heal. They just scar over. The families of the Crimson Vipers were devastated. Marcus Venom Garrett's mother, Mrs. Gloria Garrett, lived until 2019 without getting over her son's death. She died of a heart attack in her small apartment in Parramore, surrounded by photos of Marcus from when he was a child. Before the gangs, before the violence, when he still dreamed of playing college football. Tasha, Venom's pregnant girlfriend, had a baby boy in December of 1994. She named him Marcus Jr. Today he's 30 years old and works as a manager at a Target store. He never knew his father. His mother told him he died in a car accident. Of the 7 dead, only 3 had younger siblings who followed the criminal path. 1 died in a police shootout in 2008. Another is currently serving life in a federal prison for murder. The other siblings and sisters, there were 17 in total among the 7 families, managed to break the cycle. Some with humble but honest jobs, others emigrating to other states, all carrying the weight of marked surnames, of mothers who never forgave, of unanswered questions about whether their brothers deserved to die. That Parramore changed after that night in March, but not in the way one would expect. The Crimson Vipers disappeared, but their territory was quickly absorbed by larger organizations. First cells from Miami drug operations, then from Atlanta gangs moving south. The violence didn't decrease, it just changed face. The extortion continued. Drug dealing grew. Gangs kept recruiting teenagers without futures in neighborhoods, without hope. But something did change. For years in the bars of Parramore, on the corners where young men gathered, in whispered conversations between mothers who feared for their children, the legend of Thomas Johnson became a warning passed from mouth to mouth. Don't underestimate a desperate father. Some younger gang members, faced with the decision to assault a girl, remembered that story and thought twice. Not out of morality, out of fear. Because they knew that somewhere in those forgotten neighborhoods of Orlando, there were fathers like Thomas Johnson, quiet workers who loved their families more than their own lives, and when a certain line was crossed, those men transformed into something more dangerous than any gang. Detective Marcus Reed retired from the Orlando Police Department in 2018 after 43 years of service. In subsequent interviews, he said the Johnson case was the most complex of his career. Technically, Thomas Johnson was a multiple murderer. He explained in 2022, during an interview for a true crime podcast. Morally, he was a father protecting his daughter in a society that had completely failed him. The law says one thing, the heart says another. And that contradiction is something I've had to live with every day since. The story of Thomas Johnson has no heroes. It has a father who loved his daughter more than he valued his own freedom, and 7 young men who chose a violent path that ended their lives before they turned 26. It has a society that allowed gangs to dominate entire neighborhoods while authorities looked the other way, and a man who decided the only way to protect his family was to destroy his enemy. Was Thomas a murderer? Yes. He eliminated 7 people, some while they were unaware, without trial, without mercy, in a military operation executed with calculated precision. Was he a father doing the only thing he could to save his daughter? Also yes. The uncomfortable truth is that both things can be true at the same time, and that's the most disturbing part of this story, because it forces us to ask things we prefer not to ask. What would we do in his place? How far would we go to protect those we love? Does justice really exist when the system has failed so completely that an honest family has nowhere to turn? Thomas Johnson crossed a line no human being should cross. But that line was drawn in a world where authorities didn't protect, where gangs recruited children with impunity, where a 17-year-old girl could be assaulted 3 blocks from her house in broad daylight, and those responsible kept walking free because reporting meant signing a death warrant for your whole family.